Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we will learn about the dark secrets of Hollow Ridge, a place where the truth was buried along with the records that were supposed to keep it safe. This video is a made-up story that was made just for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. In the Appalachian Mountains, where fog hangs on the slopes like a secret that has been kept too long, there is a valley with a name that is whispered, only when it's needed. Hollow Ridge is a piece of land in West Virginia where things happened in 1917 that were so horrible that the county archives seem to have worked together to make sure no one remembers them. The story we're going to look at didn't start with a clear crime. It started with something much worse: the organized loss of official papers, property records, and certificates that mention a certain man, a farmer, who, according to bits and pieces of evidence found in personal diaries and letters preserved by chance, had done things that were beyond human understanding. The Appalachian region has always been known for being cut off from the rest of the world. There were miles of thick forest between whole communities, and the only way for them to get to each other was through narrow trails that wound through the mountains. Hollow Ridge was the same. The area was in Webster County and had a lot of farms where families grew tobacco and corn, raised pigs and chickens, and hunted in the forests when the weather was right. Offered, the seasons, the harshness of winter, and the unpredictable generosity of summer set the pace of life there. People knew each other by their last names, the lands they had lived on for generations, the deals they made with handshakes, and a word that was worth more than any signed paper. But in 1917, things changed. There were strange gaps in the records at the county registry office. Pages ripped out, deed books with whole blank sections as if they had never been filled out, and birth and death certificates. That just wasn't there anymore. And in the middle of this empty documentary, a name came and went like smoke. Ezekiel Thornwood was the owner of Hollow Ridge Ranch, which covered more than 400 hectares of mountainous land, including a large area of virgin forest that no one dared to enter anymore. The few records that survived this strange purge show that a man came to the area around 1905 and bought land with money that was never publicly questioned. Thornwood wasn't from the Hershire. Some people thought his accent came from the deep south, maybe Louisiana or Mississippi, but he never said for sure. He built his house on top of a hill away from the main road. It was a dark wooden structure with narrow windows that seemed to watch more than show. There were barns, sheds, and a number of smaller buildings around it. The closest neighbors didn't know what these buildings were for, but they still lived far away. Thornwood stayed away, but not completely. He came to town every 2 or 3 weeks to buy food, sell crops, and sometimes hire temporary workers to help with repairs or the harvest. People could see him during these times. He was a tall man, thin as a winter twig, with clear eyes that seemed to look at everything and everyone with an uncomfortable intensity. He didn't talk much, paid well in cash, and always left before conversations went on for too long. Needed. People who worked on Thornwood's farm gave vague and conflicting accounts. Some said the work was hard but honest, and that the farmer didn't care about them professionally. Some people, on the other hand, talked about strange feelings and the smell that kept coming from one of the faraway sheds, which they said smelled like a mix of damp earth and rusty metal. The sounds of the night echoing through the valley, like groans that could be the wind moving through the trees or something else. Not the same. And then there were the rules. Thornwood made it clear where workers could and couldn't go. He made it very clear when he hired him that some parts of the property were off limits. Anyone who broke the rules would be fired right away and not get paid. Like many other mountain communities, Hollow Ridge got by with informal networks of information. Conversations at church on Sundays, running into people on the road, and visits between neighbors who live far away. It was Through these networks, rumors about Thornwood started to spread. There were no direct accusations, but there was a lot of distrust that built up over time until it became a deep well of unease. People who worked for him said they changed after that. They got quieter, more anxious, and didn't want to talk about what had happened. Some people just left the area without saying goodbye, leaving behind their things and relationships as if they were running away from something they couldn't name. Something happened in 1912 that made things worse, these doubts. Martin Dalton, a seasonal worker who had been living on the Thornwood farm for almost 6 months, showed up at the county sheriff's house in the middle of the night. He was clearly shaken, sweating even though it was cold in October, and he insisted on making a formal statement. William Harrove, the sheriff, brought Dalton inside and listened to what he had to say. But this is the most important point. There is no official record of this talk. The incident book from that time was one of many papers that vanished from the archives. We only know what we do because of a letter Harrow's wife wrote to a sister who lived in Ohio. It was saved by chance in a family collection. She writes in the letter that her husband was clearly upset for days after that night. He went to Thornwood's farm with 2 deputies but came back without making any arrests or filing a formal complaint. Dalton left the area not long after and was never heard from again. When asked by curious onlookers, Harrove only said that there wasn't. Not enough proof to start an investigation. But something was different about him. People who knew him well saw that he started to stay away from Hollow Ridge and changed the subject whenever the name Thornwood came up. The next few years were very quiet, which was unsettling. Thornwood kept doing what he was doing. The farm did okay, and life in the area went on as usual, slowly and predictably. But something was going on under the surface of this seeming normalcy. People kept coming and going to work. Some people came and went, staying only a few days before leaving suddenly. People in the community told stories that weren't strong enough to make people act, but they were too strong to ignore. There were rumors of underground buildings, cellars, or tunnels that Thornwood supposedly dug for reasons he never explained. Some people say they saw lights moving through the woods at dusk in strange ways, as if someone were doing a ritual or ceremony. Even in faraway places like Hollow Ridge, World War I changed things. Hollow Ridge and other places. Men were drafted, the local economy suffered, and the authorities had to deal with problems that were bigger than the strange farmers' mysteries. In 1917, things finally reached a point of no return in this situation. We don't know exactly what happened that year, but we do know that an outside investigator came to the area. This person wasn't from the area, so they weren't affected by the same fears and doubts that kept the locals from acting. This investigator, whose name is Samuel Brennan in some letters, was supposedly sent by a government office that deals with managing federal lands. His job was to make a list of rural properties for the census and taxes. This bureaucratic job took him to many remote farms in the Appalachian Mountains. Brennan was organized, polite, and very dedicated to his job. He had notebooks with him all the time. The size of the property, the condition of the land, and the number of buildings, how easy it is to get to them, and roads. To him, each farm was just another piece of information to be processed and filed. Brennan had no reason to think anything other than a normal inspection when he got to Hollow Ridge one afternoon in March. The mountains were starting to wake up from winter, and with them came that timid green that comes before the full bloom of summer. Brennan had to leave his carriage on the main road because the road to the Thornwood estate was steep and not well kept, and walk the last few miles. He wrote this down in his notebook, saying that it was hard to get to and that this would have made it harder to get farm goods to the markets. Thorne would have greeted him with the cold politeness that was his trademark. He gave Brennan water, let him look around the main barns and farmland, and answered questions with great accuracy. Everything seemed to be going well until Brennan looked at his preliminary maps and saw that the official maps didn't match up with what he had seen. Property lines and what Thornwood said it owned. There was a lot of land, about 80 acres of dense forest north of the main house, that didn't show up on any official purchase records or deeds. Thornwood looked uncomfortable for the first time when asked about this. His explanation was unclear and didn't make sense. He talked about verbal agreements with past owners, papers that were said to have been lost in a fire at the registry office years ago, and local land tenure customs. That didn't exactly follow the rules of the law. Brennan, who was used to dealing with similar situations in other rural areas, didn't think this was anything out of the ordinary at first. People in the Appalachians often used unofficial ways to buy and sell land. He just pointed out the difference and asked Thorne to fix it when he could. But then the request came that changed everything. Brennan, as he usually does, said he wanted to go for a walk around the edges of the property, which include the wooded area in question. He wanted to see for himself how the land was doing and find natural landmarks that could be used as reference points for future surveys. It was a fair request and an important part of his job. Thornwood's response was quick and strong. He absolutely refused, saying that the forest was dangerous because it had hidden ravines and wild animals, and that he rarely went there himself, let alone let a visitor go there. Take the chance. The strong refusal in Thornwood's voice, which was usually calm, sounded almost desperate, which made Brennan feel more than just professional curiosity. The investigator chose not to push the matter at that time. He thanked them for their hospitality, finished writing down his notes on the places he had seen, and left, saying he would be back in a few weeks to finish the survey. But the doubt had already started to grow. Brennan was a detail-oriented man who had been trained to spot inconsistencies and something about. Thornwood's response didn't make sense. While he was staying at an inn in the closest town, he started to ask questions that weren't too obvious. He talked to the blacksmith, the innkeeper, and the merchants, and that's how the stories started to get to him. Everyone had their own story to tell, but the themes were the same. Thornwood's remoteness, the workers who left without warning, the sounds at night, the areas of the farm that were off-limits, and the incident with Martin Dalton years ago. Brennan, who is naturally skeptical, at first he thought most of it was just small-town gossip and rural superstition, but the more he looked into it, the more he saw that the inconsistencies were consistent. There were patterns in the stories, with details that came up over and over again, no matter where they came from. And most of all, there was the clear fear that people showed when they talked about the farmer from Hollow Ridge. The investigator made the decision to find Sheriff Harrove. From the start, the meeting between the two was tense. Hargrove clearly didn't want to talk about Thornwood, but Brennan had the power of the federal government behind him and knew how to use it. When pushed, the sheriff finally admitted that there were suspicions and that something strange had been reported years ago, but there was no solid proof to back up any legal action. Harrove looked uncomfortable when Brennan asked about the official records from that time. He said that many papers had been lost over the years, that the registry office wasn't very well organized, and that it wasn't unusual for files to go missing. In small counties with little money. But the way Harrove spoke, with a weight to his words and a pause that made it seem like he knew something that the other person didn't, made it seem like he knew something that the other person didn't. Brennan understood that he was up against a man who was torn between his duty and his fear, between what he knew was right and what he thought was smart. The sheriff ended the talk with a warning that wasn't very clear. He said that Hollow Ridge was a place where smart people didn't get involved, that there were things in the mountains that were better left alone, and that the law couldn't or shouldn't always get to every corner. It was odd advice coming from someone who worked for justice, and it only made Brennan more determined. Brennan spent the next few days quietly looking into the matter, almost to the point of obsession. He went to the county registry office in person to ask for access to the property records for Hollow Ridge. What he found was troubling. There are missing pages from the deed books where Thornwood's records should have been. Certificates with dates that didn't make any sense in terms of time. Sense. Documents that talk about other documents that don't exist. It was as if someone had spent years carefully erasing Ezekiel Thornwood's name from the official files, but they had not been able to get rid of all the evidence. There were still pieces left over, vague references, and documentary shadows that hinted at something much bigger than just bureaucratic chaos. As Brennan flipped through the old books, the clerk, an old man named Preston Walsh, became more and more nervous. Finally, when they were by themselves, Walsh came up to the archive and spoke in a low voice. He said he had worked there for more than 30 years and had seen strange nighttime visits. People who would show up after hours with vague authorizations and ask for access to certain records, pages that would mysteriously disappear, and important people in the community putting subtle pressure on him to say that certain documents were lost or damaged. Walsh never had the guts to ask or report it, but he felt guilty about it. He was aware that he was involved in something bad, but he also knew that keeping quiet would keep him safe. This new information changed the whole nature of Brennan's investigation. He was no longer just dealing with a strange farmer on a remote piece of land. He was up against something planned, a conspiracy of silence that involved many parts of the community. Someone had a lot to lose if the truth about Thornwood came out, and that person had worked hard to make sure that documentary proof was destroyed. Brennan's question was simple but scary. What could be so bad that Erasure would go to such lengths to stop it? He chose to look for other sources of information, such as personal letters, diaries, and records from his local church. He learned that the Hollow Ridge Baptist Church kept its own records of births, marriages, deaths, and notes on members of the congregation. Reverend Marcus Caldwell, the pastor, was a middle-aged man with tired eyes that looked like they had seen a lot more than they should have. At first, he didn't want to let Brennan look at the records, but after a long talk about moral duty and the value of truth, he finally agreed. The church records showed some troubling patterns. Since Thornwood moved to the area, there had been an unusual number of people leaving without warning. It was as if families had disappeared from the records. One entry talked about temporary workers, but they never came back. What was most disturbing was that a lot of these names were the same as those of people who. The stories Brennan had gathered were about people who had worked for Thornwood at some point. Reverend Caldwell looked at the records with a sad look on his face and finally admitted that he had prayed for years that his suspicions were wrong. But deep down he knew that something very bad was going on in those mountains. Brennan also found letters in a collection that the local historical society has. One of them, written by a traveling professor in 1914, talked about a trip to Hollow Ridge and how uneasy it made him feel, spread throughout the area. The professor wrote about talking to people who lived nearby who whispered about the farmer on the hill, how people tried not to look at that property when they passed by on the road, and how children were told never to go near those lands. The professor said something that really stood out. It's as if everyone knew a terrible secret, but no one dared to say it out loud, as if the very words could bring on unbearable pain. Consequences. With this growing pile of circumstantial evidence, Brennan made a choice that would shape everything that came after. He would go back to the Thornwood farm, but this time he wouldn't tell anyone, and he wouldn't be alone. He got 2 federal officials who were passing through the area to go with him by claiming that there were serious problems that needed to be looked into right away. They were outsiders who didn't know anyone in the area and didn't have the deep-seated fears that kept the people of Hollow Ridge from acting. For them, it was just another task for the office that might or might not show something important. The second trip to the ranch was on a cloudy morning in April. The mountains looked like ghosts in the low fog, and the air felt cool and damp, like it does in the spring in the Appalachians. Thornwood opened the door and looked at them with a mix of surprise and something darker, more planned. Brennan showed them his credentials and told them they needed to do a full inspection of the land, which includes all the buildings and wooded areas. It wasn't a request. It was an official notice that had the full power of the federal government. The farmer tried to use property rights privacy to defend himself by saying he hadn't done anything wrong. But the deputies wouldn't budge. They had permission to do the inspection, whether he helped them or not. Thorne would have known he had no choice. At that moment, something changed in his eyes. They turned cold and resigned, which Brennan took as acceptance of the inevitable. The farmer put on a coat and said he would go with them, but they would regret bothering him. It was a strange phrase that could mean a lot of different things. The main barns and sheds were the first things to be checked. At first glance, everything looked normal. Farm tools, bags of grain, and equipment that needed repairs. But as they got closer to the buildings that were farther away, on the edges of the property, the mood changed. Thornwood said that one shed was empty and only used for storage every now and then. When the deputies broke down the door, they found something else. There were strange compartments inside, which were small, closed-off spaces that didn't seem to have any purpose. There were marks on the walls, deep scratches in the wood, as if something or someone had tried to get out. There were chains hanging from beams and metal things whose purpose was very unclear. Brennan's stomach tightened as he looked at those compartments. He asked Thornwood straight out what the point of that was, what the structure was. The farmer didn't say anything for a long time, and when he did, his explanation sounded rehearsed and empty. He said he kept sick animals in those spaces so they wouldn't be around the other animals. During veterinary care, the chains were used to keep especially aggressive pigs from moving around. The marks on the walls were there because animals that were kept in cages acted that way. He thought that everything could be explained in a logical way. Even though his voice drew attention, that was the opposite of naturalness he was trying to show. The deputies looked at each other. They were smart enough to know when something didn't make sense, but they also knew that suspicions weren't proof. There was nothing in that shed that could be clearly called illegal. Yes, it's disturbing and strange, but it doesn't have to be a crime. Brennan insisted on continuing the inspection, especially in the wooded area that Thornwood had said was off-limits before. The rancher tried. I tried one last time to change their minds by talking about how hard the terrain was and how easy it would be to get lost in the thick trees, but the men were already set on their course. The forest that surrounded the northern part of the property was very old and thick. Most of the sunlight was blocked by huge trees, which made it feel like it was always twilight, even in the middle of the day. Thick layers of dead leaves that had built up over decades, maybe even centuries, covered the ground. It was the kind of place that looked like it had never been touched by. People's presence kept in a perfect state. But as they got closer, Brennan started to see small signs of life, like marks on trees that looked like landmarks and trails that were almost invisible that wound their way through the plants. After walking for about half an hour, they found the first hidden structure. It was a small building that was half buried in the ground and covered by plants that had grown over it over the years. It was a cabin or shelter that would have been easy to miss if you weren't looking for something like it. A rusty padlock kept the door shut. Thornwood, who was a few meters behind the group, watched in complete silence. One of the deputies used a tool he had with him to break the padlock. The door creaked as it opened because the wood was wet and the hinges were rusty. The inside was dark and cold, and it smelled like dirt and death, which is what places that have been closed for a long time smell like. Boxes were stacked against the walls and covered with waterproof tarpaulin. Brennan opened one and found clothes, personal items, papers, little things that clearly belonged to different people, pocket watches, worn leather wallets, and old pictures of people whose faces you don't know. It was like a bunch of lives that had been cut short, physical memories of people who were no longer there to claim them. Each box held things from different people that were organized in a way that was very disturbing. Thornwood finally spoke, and his voice was strangely calm given the situation. He said that these things belonged to workers who had left the farm over the years, without taking their things. He had kept them, hoping that they would come back or get in touch with him in some way to get them back. He said it was an act of preservation, not hiding. But the number was disturbing. There were dozens of sets of things that belonged to dozens of people who just left everything behind. Brennan knew that poor people and temporary workers didn't easily give up their few things. A watch could be the only thing that someone in the family owned. Pictures were priceless treasures. No one would choose to leave all of that behind. The search went deeper into the woods. They found more structures like this one, each with more evidence of the same kind. Then they found something else. An artificial clearing where trees had been cut down on purpose at some point in the past. There was a hole in the ground in the middle of this clearing, as if something big had been buried there and the ground had settled over time. One of the deputies, who had a gut feeling about the investigation, started digging with a shovel they had brought. He didn't have to dig very far before he ran into something. Wood, a structure that is buried. It took a lot of hard work over the course of many hours to find out what was under the ground. It was like a secret room made of thick planks and beams that made it stronger. The entrance was closed, but not as well as the other buildings. When they finally got it open, they found a room that looked like it had been used as a storage room or warehouse. But why? The walls inside showed signs of wear and tear, stains that make it look wet and old. There were hooks on the beams, empty containers piled up in a corner, and tools that weren't clear what they were for right away. Thornwood, who had been quiet during the digging, finally spoke up. He tried to get away by taking a few steps toward the forest as if he wanted to run away. As soon as he started to speak, the deputy stopped him and held him tightly. Quickly, almost without making sense. He said they wouldn't get that everything had a reason and that he had only done what he had to do. His words were broken up, moving from one topic to another without a clear link. He talked about things that needed to be done, experiments that needed certain materials, and knowledge he had gained through studies that most people would think were wrong. The deputies took Thornwood back to the main house, and Brennan stayed in the woods, carefully, writing down each find. He took pictures, drew detailed pictures in his notebooks, and gathered samples of things he found in the underground buildings. He knew he would need strong proof to make a case that would hold up in court. But the more he looked into it, the more he realized that what he was up against didn't make sense in a normal way. It wasn't just how many hidden structures there were or what kinds of objects were found. You could feel that this place had seen things that had an effect on the very earth. When Brennan got back to Thornwood's house late in the afternoon, he saw the deputies searching the main rooms. They had found an impressive library with hundreds of books lined up on dark wood shelves. This was impressive for a remote farmhouse. But these weren't just regular books about farming or popular fiction. They were old books about outdated medical practices, philosophical essays about how the mind works, and procedural guides that had been left behind by modern science as wrong or not useful. Thornwood also kept personal notebooks in which he wrote down detailed observations about behavior, physical reactions, and limits of endurance in different situations. The writings showed that the person was obsessed with figuring out strange things about human life. Thornwood talked about experiments he did that didn't seem to be done out of malice, but rather out of a clinical curiosity that was even more disturbing. He thought of himself as a scholar, someone who was willing to go into new areas, that other people thought were wrong for moral reasons in the name of higher knowledge. He thought that social norms and moral limits were fake barriers that kept people from really understanding. In his notes, he said that people without strong family ties or roots, like itinerant workers, were resources that society was wasting and that he could use for better things. It was shocking how coldly he talked about these ideas. There was no emotion in the texts, and they didn't say anything about the suffering that his actions had caused. It was like reading the journals of someone who had completely cut themselves off from being human and turned people into things to study. As Brennan flipped through those notebooks, he started to feel sick. He understood that he wasn't dealing with a normal criminal who was motivated by anger or greed. Instead, he was dealing with someone who had built an entire philosophy to justify terrible things. They found letters among the papers that showed surprising links between them. Thornwood talked to other people who were interested in the same things he was. There were letters from rogue doctors, researchers who had been kicked out of universities for doing things that were not right, and people who lived on the edges of society. They talked about theories, shared discoveries, and shared information. It was a secret group of people who had decided to throw away all moral limits in order to learn things that they thought were too hard for regular science to understand. One of the notes was especially revealing and dated 1916. Someone named Dr. Silas, who lived somewhere in Louisiana, sent it. He praised Thornwood for having the guts to do work that others might think is wrong, and talked about his own research in similar areas. He said he would soon go to Hollow Ridge to see the buildings that Thornwood had built for himself. The letter suggested that this visit did happen because Thornwood wrote back months later to thank him for the advice and talk about changes he had made based on what the visitors had said. The deputies also found a very detailed map of the property that was much more complete than any official record. It put notes on all the hidden structures in the forest, explaining what each one was for. Some places had strange symbols next to them, codes that Brennan couldn't figure out right away. The map showed that they had only found a small part of what was on those lands. There were at least 6 other structures that were buried or hidden that had not yet been found. It was decided that Thornwood would be arrested right away and that a bigger team would be put together to search the property thoroughly. One of the deputies rode off on horseback to get more help, while the other stayed behind to watch over the prisoner. Brennan used the last few hours of daylight to check out another place on the map. He walked alone along a path that led to a deep ravine that was thick with plants. There he found another underground room, this one even more detailed than the ones before. A layer of stones and branches made the entrance look like a natural pile of trash. But when this covering was taken off, a wooden door with metal reinforcement was revealed. Brennan broke in and walked down steps made of packed dirt into a big room that had been dug out of the rocky ground. Wooden beams held up the walls, and the ceiling was so low that he had to bend his head a little to see. There were hooks for oil lamps. Still had fuel in it, which means it had been used recently. What he found inside was both interesting and scary at the same time. A kind of temporary lab with tools that looked like they had been borrowed from hospitals and factories. Workbenches with tools that are arranged with great care. Brennan didn't want to look too closely at the contents of the containers that held preserved liquids. Detailed records stacked on shelves, each with a date and a reference number. It was clear that Thornwood had spent years building that secret space, making its facilities better and adding to its capabilities. Brennan took some of the records and started reading them with his own flashlight. The texts talked about things that had been done for more than 10 years. Thornwood kept very detailed records of everything, including variables, results, and conclusions, There were tables that compared different approaches, graphs that showed how things changed over time, and notes about what factors affected the results of his tests. It was like reading the work of a dedicated scientist, but the subjects were people, and the methods were completely unacceptable by any moral standard. When Brennan came out of that underground room, it was already dark over Hollow Ridge. The stars shone very brightly on the mountains, which were not affected by the artificial light that was starting to change the bigger cities. He walked back to the main house with a box of papers that he thought were very important to the investigation. There was one main question that kept coming to mind for him. How could something like this have stayed hidden for so long? How could a whole community suspect, fear, and never do anything about what was going on in those lands? He was starting to figure out that the answer lay in the very nature of the people Thornwood chose as victims. People who worked temporary jobs and didn't have families, people who moved around looking for seasonal work, and people who had cut ties with their home communities. These were people who would not be missed if they were gone. Create organized searches, and their absence would be blamed on their nomadic lifestyle. Thornwood had thought carefully about who to choose, picking only those whose disappearance would go unnoticed or be easy to explain. When someone with stronger ties went missing, there was a way to erase records to hide the evidence. But who had helped Thornwood change the official files? This question haunted Brennan as he thought about everything he had learned. The rancher couldn't have done it by himself. He would have needed help from people in local institutions who were willing to ignore what was going on or even help cover it up. And he would have needed a lot of motivation to get them to work with him. Probably money. Thornwood had a lot of money, but no one ever really explained where it came from. But maybe there were also threats, intimidation, and the kind of quiet pressure that small towns know all too well. At home, he saw the deputy watching Thornwood in the main room, watching over the main room. The prisoner was sitting in a chair with his hands tied, but he looked strangely calm. Thorny would look up and talk for the first time in hours when Brennan came in. He said that the investigator was wrong to judge what he did by common moral standards. He said that history is full of examples of people who were judged harshly at the time, but later seen as geniuses. That knowledge always required sacrifices, and that future generations would understand the worth of what he had tried to do. It was a speech that showed how deeply Thornwood's mind was warped. He really thought he was helping with something bigger, and that science would eventually prove him right. He didn't feel bad. He was just angry that someone had interrupted him before he could finish what he thought was his work. Brennan listened in silence, knowing that he was talking to someone who had no empathy for other people. There was no logical reason that could break through this wall of self-justification that Thornwood had put up around himself. The night went on and on. The deputy who had gone to get more help wouldn't be back until the next morning, so they had to wait. Brennan took the time to look more closely at the papers he had gathered. He found something among them that changed how he saw the whole thing. It was an old letter from 1904 that was sent to Thornwood by someone who only signed it as mentor. The text was hard to understand, but revealing, talking about how important it is to choose the right place to study, how important it is to be alone and discreet, and how to make sure that neighbors didn't find out or didn't care. The letter said that Thornwood hadn't thought of his actions on his own. Another person with similar experience had taught, trained, and prepared him. The letter also suggested that there were others like him living in different remote areas and doing the same thing. Their own creepy investigations in secret because they were far away from everyone else. It was a bigger network than Brennan had thought. It was an invisible group of people who shared interests that civilized society completely rejected. This finding changed the case from looking into a single criminal to something that could be much bigger. If Thornwood was part of a group that was organized, then catching him could lead to more discoveries and places that needed to be looked into. But it also meant trouble. People with money and power might try to protect their own interests by silencing witnesses and destroying evidence. Brennan knew he had to be very careful about what to do next, who to tell what, and who he could trust in the official structures. The sound of horses at dawn signaled the arrival of more troops. The deputy came back with Sheriff Hargrove and 4 other men. Harrove looked shaken, as if part of him had hoped the suspicions wouldn't be true. He looked at Thornwood with a look that was a mix of anger and something like sadness. He might have wished he had done something years ago when Martin Dalton came to him with scary news. He might have felt guilty about the lives that could have been saved if he had been brave enough to do a proper investigation. Using the map they found, the bigger team started a methodical search of the whole property. In the days that followed, they found all of the marked hidden structures as well as others that weren't even written down. With each new find, they learned more about what Thornwood had built there. It wasn't just a bunch of random hiding spots. It was a carefully planned and carried-out complex that took more than 10 years to build. The way the structures were set up made sense. Each one had a specific purpose that was clear from the way they were arranged. One of the most disturbing things we found was a structure that looked like it had been used as an archive. It had very detailed records, not just what Thornwood did, but also letters he sent to other people in his network, names, locations, and descriptions of work that was going on in places as far apart as the Oregon mountains and the Florida swamps. The size of the network was shocking. Brennan understood that he had proof of a conspiracy that was happening all over the country and would go on forever in the shadows. But things were getting worse. As more and more evidence came in and the case grew bigger, Brennan started to notice. Some local governments are quietly resisting. People said that it might be better to keep some information secret, that too much publicity could hurt the area, and that some evidence was too vague to be useful. He saw the signs of an attempt to limit the investigation's scope so that it wouldn't reach people or organizations that would rather stay hidden. At that moment, Brennan had to make a very important choice. He started making copies of the evidence before anyone could mess with it. Everything he thought was important. He worked late into the night by lamplight, copying maps and writing down every detail in his own notebooks. He sent encrypted messages to trusted people in other areas, people who weren't part of his local network but could keep information safe in case something happened to him. It was a precaution that might have seemed paranoid at the time, but later events would show that it was smart. Thornwood was officially arrested and would have to wait for his trial in the Sung County Jail, but he still seemed calm, which was strange. He seemed sure that the legal system wouldn't really catch up with him in some way. When asked about this confidence, he just smiled mysteriously and said that he had made plans and backups that would come into play when needed. Brennan thought this was a reference to his network of friends, who had a personal stake in protecting one of their own to keep the larger operation from being exposed. And indeed, strange things started to happen. Brennan's papers that he had given to the police station went missing overnight, even though the doors were locked and there was supposed to be constant surveillance. A strange fire burned down part of the barn where physical evidence was being kept for a short time. Witnesses who had promised to give statements changed their minds all of a sudden. Some people left the area without telling anyone. It was clear that unseen forces were trying to stop the investigation from happening. Sheriff Hargrove, to his credit, fought against this. Interference. He had finally found the strength to face the fears that had kept him from moving for years, and he was determined to see justice done. But he was just a man in a weak spot, relying on local systems that weren't working well. One night, he went to see Brennan privately and told him that important people in the area were putting pressure on him. Businessmen, landowners, and even a member of the state government had all gotten in touch to say that it would be best for everyone if the case were settled, quietly, with little fanfare or in-depth investigation. Brennan knew he couldn't just depend on the police in his area. He asked for direct help from his bosses in Washington, D.C., using his federal job. He sent detailed reports, including copies of the most important evidence, asking for help from higher levels of government. But the answer was frustratingly slow and full of red tape. There were rules to follow, areas of responsibility to respect, and political issues to think about. The federal government, which is supposed to be very powerful, was slow and clumsy when faced with something that challenged established categories. At the same time, the Hollow Ridge community responded in complicated and sometimes contradictory ways. Some people were shocked and horrified when they found out how bad Thornwood's actions were. They said they never thought anything like that could happen. Some people said they always knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do or who to talk to. There were also people who pushed for a twisted idea of local loyalty that said the region should solve its own problems without help from outside. The last group was small but loud, which made things even more tense and made it harder to do the investigation. One of the most interesting parts was when Brennan decided to find some of the workers who had left the Thornwood farm years ago. Contrary to what people thought, they were still alive and living somewhere else. He found 3 of them through job records and letters. He went to see them in person to interview them, hoping they could tell him what they had seen or done while they were at Hollow Ridge. The talks were both helpful and annoying at the same time. The 3 men agreed that something was very wrong on the farm. They talked about how oppressive the atmosphere was, how strange noises came from places they weren't allowed to go at night, and how they always felt like they were being watched. One of them said they saw through a window that was only partially open. Of the sheds, tools that looked like medical or surgical tools that didn't belong on a rural farm. Another person talked about a time when they saw Thornwood talking to a well-dressed visitor who arrived in an elegant carriage. They were talking about progress and results in low voices, as if they were working together on a secret project. But when asked to testify in court, the 3 were hesitant. They had families now, lives set up in new places, and the chance to get involved in a complicated and they were scared of a legal case that could be dangerous. One of them, to be honest, said he was afraid of retaliation and thought Thornwood had powerful connections that could reach him, even hundreds of miles away. This unwillingness to testify in court made the case Brennan was trying to build a lot weaker. Physical evidence was important, but direct testimony from people who were there would have a much bigger effect on any trial. Thornwood, who was being held while waiting for trial, made things very serious when he suddenly got very sick. Doctors in the county found a condition that needed specialized care that wasn't available in the small local jail. He was moved to a hospital in a bigger city, where he was guarded but had better access to medical care. Brennan quickly thought this was part of a plan, a way to make it easier for people to escape or cause more trouble. He would find out that his suspicions were true in a way he couldn't have predicted. On the second night Thornwood was in the hospital, something strange happened. There was a mix-up. Guards who were supposed to be watching his room had to leave for a short time to deal with a problem on another floor of the building. When they got back, they saw that the bed was empty and the window was open. Thornwood was gone, and even after a lot of searching in the days that followed, no sign of him was found. It was as if he had just disappeared, leaving behind only the proof of what he had done and the questions that would haunt the area for years to come. Brennan was heartbroken by the escape. All the work he had done, all the risk, and all the fighting to keep things from getting in the way. And in the end, the person who was most to blame got away. He pushed for an inquiry into the escape. believing that it had been planned and that the guards' stories didn't match up. The fact that the disturbance happened at a convenient time for them, and the fact that Thorne seemed to have left the hospital easily all pointed to careful planning. However, proving it was a different story, especially when the people involved were protected by layers of bureaucracy and influence. People who were involved were safe because of layers of bureaucracy and power. In the months after Thornwood's escape, everyone involved in the investigation felt more and more frustrated, and like something was wrong. Brennan wouldn't let the disappearance be the end of the story. He spent every free moment looking for the fugitive farmer, following leads that took him to several states. There were reports that a man who looked like Thornwood was seen in a small town in Kentucky and then in a remote village in Tennessee, always in places where it was easy to blend in with people who didn't ask too many questions about newcomers' pasts. Every time Brennan got to one of these places, he only found cold traces and vague memories. People who thought they had seen someone like that but weren't sure. Owners of boarding houses who remembered a single guest who paid in cash and left without warning. It was like running after a shadow that always stayed one step ahead and was always out of reach. The investigator started to think that Thornwood's network of friends was actively helping him, and that there was a set way to protect and move members when they were in trouble with the law. In the meantime, Thornwood's property in Hollow Ridge stayed in a strange state of limbo. He was legally the owner, but he couldn't claim it because he was a wanted fugitive. Local officials put up a temporary guard over the land, but there wasn't much maintenance. The structures started to fall apart because of time and lack of care. The main house, which used to be well kept even though it looked bare, started to show signs of neglect. The wind broke the windows, storms ripped off the tiles, and plants started to take back areas that had been kept clean for years. The forest, with all of its hidden structures, had gone back to being impossible to get through. Trails were blocked by fallen trees. Plants grew over the doors to the underground rooms. And over time, it got even harder to get around the place than it had been before. People in the area thought that the land itself didn't want people to touch it, as if it wanted to bury the secrets it had seen. Few people were brave enough to go near the property, and those who did said that the atmosphere made them want to leave right away. Brennan's ongoing investigations led him to a discovery that changed the whole picture. He was able to get files through contacts at schools and universities on scientists who have been kicked out of or pushed to the edges of the scientific community in the last few decades. He found references to an informal group in these records that called themselves Seekers of Transcendental Knowledge. These were people who thought that regular science was limited by unnecessary moral concerns. They wrote to each other, published papers in little-known journals from time to time, and apparently got together at random times to talk about what they had found. Records showed Thornwood's name, but they also showed many more. Doctors who had lost their licenses for bad behavior, academic researchers whose study proposals had been turned down by ethics committees, and people with enough money to set up their own private labs where they didn't have to answer to any institutional authority. It was a whole subculture that lived on the edges of polite society and was united by a shared refusal to follow moral rules that most people thought were basic. One of the mysterious Dr. Silas, who was mentioned in the letters found on the Thornwood property, was one of the people who wrote these letters over and over. Brennan was able to find out who he really was by comparing information from several documents. He used to be a professor of medicine at a university in the South, but he had to quit when people accused him of doing unethical experiments. He had moved to a remote plantation in Louisiana where he could do his research without being bothered by anyone. Eyes that are critical. The investigator thought about going there to face Silas, but his bosses told him not to. Without clear authority and direct proof that Silas was involved in certain crimes, taking such action could lead to legal problems. Moreover, there was a chance that the whole network would find out how much the authorities knew about their operations. Choosing between taking action right away and waiting patiently was a frustrating strategic choice. But Brennan didn't want to, but he agreed to hold off until a stronger case could be made. Something strange happened in Hollow Ridge. One of the workers Brennan had talked to before, the one who saw strange medical equipment on the farm, decided not to testify. He wrote a letter to the investigator saying that his conscience wouldn't let him stay quiet anymore. He had been thinking about other people who might have had a worse fate than his every night. He was ready to testify formally, no matter what the risks to themselves. This was the first big break in the wall of silence that had kept Thornwood's actions secret for so long. Brennan made sure that the testimony was officially recorded and that several copies were made and sent to different authorities in case they were lost or destroyed. The man, whose name was written down in the papers as Thomas Whitley, told a detailed story about his 4 months working on the farm in the summer of 1915. He talked about what he did every day and the places he went, allowed him to see things that didn't fit the story of a normal farming operation, which was very important. Whitley talked about nights when he heard the sounds of carriages arriving long after dark, and conversations coming through open windows. Thorne would talk about things that had nothing to do with farming. He talked about a time when he woke up in the middle of the night because he was thirsty, and left the workers' quarters to see lights moving toward the forest. He followed at a distance, curious, and saw Thornwood and 2 other men he didn't know go into one of the hidden buildings. They were carrying boxes and tools and working quietly, like people who were used to doing the same thing. The testimony also talked about how other workers' behavior had changed. One man, who had been happy and friendly, became shy and anxious after being told to work on a certain part of the property. Another one just vanished. Thornwood left suddenly one night, and the next morning he told everyone that he had left all of his things behind, including weeks' worth of work savings. Whitley said that at the time he believed these reasons because he had no reason to doubt them, but looking back, the patterns were clearly suspicious. With this testimony in hand, Brennan once more tried to push for a wider investigation into the network that Thornwood was a part of. He said that only paying attention to the fugitive farmer was missing. A much bigger problem in the system. There were other people doing similar things who were protected by the same isolation and influence mechanisms that had kept Thornwood going for so long. But the response from higher authorities was not very strong. They admitted there was a problem, but they said they didn't have enough resources. It was too complicated to figure out who was in charge, and it was hard to build cases against people who were working on private property that was far away. Brennan was starting to understand the painful truth that the system was either not ready or not motivated enough to handle this kind of crime. Crimes that happened in the dark against people who were already on the fringes and in places that most people would rather not think about didn't get the help and attention they needed. There was a kind of institutional laziness that made it easier to leave some things buried. This wasn't always out of malice, but because it was easier and because people tend to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. Brennan was angry but not defeated, so he made a choice. That would shape the rest of his career. He would start to write down everything he had learned in great detail, making a record that could be used in future investigations, even if the current one didn't come to satisfactory conclusions. He spent whole nights putting together evidence, linking different cases and people, and making a map of the network that was both real and figurative. He knew he might not finish the job in his lifetime, but it could be the start of something bigger. Others to go on. Hollow Ridge changed without anyone noticing in the years that followed. The empty house on the hill became part of the landscape in a new way. It was no longer someone's home, but a place that lived on the edges of people's memories. Things started to fall apart because of the passage of time. Wood rotting, roofs falling down, and walls leaning at angles that seem impossible before finally giving up completely. Nature, patient and unending, took back every inch that the farmer had once mastered. Brennan kept working for a few more years, but the search became less intense over time. Not by giving up, but by slowly realizing that some stories don't have good endings. Some questions are like mountain mist, hanging in the air, visible but not touchable, there but not able to be understood. He kept his files neat and tidy, adding new information to them when he got it. But over time, the initial obsession turned into a quieter, more lasting determination. Over the years, rumors would sometimes come from faraway places. A traveler would swear he saw a man who looked like Thornwood at a train station far away. A merchant would talk about a single customer who didn't say much and always paid with old coins. But every time these threads were pulled, they came apart into memories that didn't make sense and weren't sure what they were. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. It always slipped away when you thought you had something solid. Like small towns do, the people of Hollow Ridge learned to deal with the ghosts of their past. Not by fighting directly or fully processing, but by slowly and quietly accepting. People stopped talking openly about the farmer on the hill, but that didn't mean they forgot about him. It was more like keeping something painful safe inside themselves, knowing it was there but not letting it take over their lives right now. Life went on because it had to, with its harvests and its seasons, births, and natural goodbyes. Sheriff Hargrove carried the burden of his past doubts until the end of his life. He would sit alone at night, looking at the mountains and thinking about the choices he had made and the ones he had not made. He thought about whether things would have been different if he had taken more decisive action years earlier. These are questions that don't really have answers. Only endless guesses that go around in endless circles. He never said a word. He never talked about these thoughts in public, but people who knew him well could see the change and the heavy burden he was carrying. People began to tell stories about the structures in the forest, like the hidden chambers and underground chambers. But every time the story was told again, the details changed. What was scary turned into something strange. What was clear became unclear. What was real and what was imagined came together. This is how group memories work, especially when it comes to things that people don't want to think about too closely. The truth stays hidden under layers of new interpretations until what is left is more of a myth than a fact. Thornwood, no matter where he was, became less of a person and more of a thought. He stood for something about the dark places that are not only found on maps, but also in people's lives. Those places where people can make choices without anyone seeing them, where people can break rules without facing immediate consequences, and where being far away from organized society gives people a dangerous freedom if they want it. To take advantage of it. He was an example that was probably unique in its details, but it was also a sign of a bigger problem that was happening on the edges. Brennan, in the last years of his career before he retired, started to see the Hollow Ridge case not as a failure on his part, but as a lesson about how human systems can fail. There will always be holes in the law, no matter how well it is written or how committed the institutions are. There will always be places that aren't covered by the network of protection and surveillance. Not because, to a planned design flaw, but just because it's impossible to be everywhere at once, see everything, and completely protect against people who want to work in the shadows. He gave his files to his successors in the hopes that they could help with future investigations, or at least keep track of what had been found and what was still unknown. Some of the younger investigators were interested and followed some leads for a while, but in the end, they were also pulled into other cases and other urgent matters. Thornwood was a network. Part of, if it really existed to the extent that the evidence suggested, was too strong, too spread out, and had too many layers of secrecy and power to be fully exposed. For decades, the property itself stayed empty. People would sometimes say that it should be sold so that the land could be used for something useful, but there was always a pause, an unexplained reluctance to own something that had seen so much bad things happen. It was as if the place itself had a bad reputation that made it. Not by law, but by an unspoken agreement among everyone, it was untouchable. It slowly returned to the forest, becoming part of the landscape until one day there might not be a difference between what was built by people and what has always been nature. The stories lived on in bits and pieces. People who came to the area from time to time, maybe historians who were interested in the area's unique features, or just people who were curious and heard rumors, would ask questions. The older residents talked about what they knew or what they wanted to share, always with the fear that came from talking about things they would rather forget. Younger generations only knew watered-down versions of the stories, which had lost their original clarity and gained parts that made them easier to tell or just more interesting. In the end, Hollow Ridge is a reflection on the spaces between what we know and what we don't know, between what can be proven and what can only be suspected. It's a reminder that not everything. Stories have endings that are clear and satisfying. Some stay open, with questions that will never be fully answered and loose ends that will never be tied up. There may also be value in acknowledging that uncertainty is inherent to the human experience, and that not all phenomena can or should be fully comprehended. The mist still falls on those mountains, just like it always has, without caring about the human dramas that happened underneath it. In their natural cycles, trees grow and die. Streams are moving, through ravines where stone is worn down with time. And in this landscape, which goes on living without human stories, there are still signs of what used to be. No longer available, no longer useful in everyday life, but still there, preserved by time and distance. If this trip through the dark places of Hollow Ridge moved you, you might want to subscribe to the channel. Please leave a comment, and if you liked it, a like helps me keep writing these stories. See you next time.